Hey guys, my name is Ruben Nelson. In this video, I want to talk about the whole mechanics of a cult because obviously it's a very hot topic right now. And I am running for GOP congressional candidate. And obviously, this is a very important issue to me because, in a lot of ways, is the reason why I started to run in the first place, meaning that I was and understand a cult like world and situation very much quite well. And so, first and foremost, we must understand what the objective is for even this video, right? And so the issues that arise with something like a cult like practice is that whether you are the perpetrator of this behavior or the one antagonizing a specific group, when you think about a cult, but the problem with this system is that the people that in a certain case seem to be the freedom fighters or the ones that are uprising, the ones that are uh the ones that are is essentially the defenders of the quote unquote truths are just as much imprisoned, although there is this feeling or ideology that once you revolt or rebel against the system, you are somehow free. And Teal Swan just made a video about this that's really, really good, but it basically explains how you're very much not free and you're further into the really the wounds that perpetuated the incessant passion for this particular in response to this particular set of characteristics or beliefs in the first place, right? So the first objective is if you are a part of these general characteristics as a society or as an individual, which, in my opinion, or not even my opinion, we must look at what it is within our culture or within the world that has created a system or galvanized a world where such radicalization, quote unquote, is possible. And so, first and foremost, I will go over the line by line definition of what is a cult as defined by qualities and characteristics of a cult from a website named cultresearch.org. And we're going to go line by line because something that's important to understand is as someone that was very much in a situation where I felt was somewhat of a victim of this kind of brainwashing and then became extremely passionate in overcoming it and fighting it and really understanding the mechanics that composite. It's something that I can tell you for a fact is that with any cult, something that is going to always be present is you're going to introduce a narrative that is fundamentally uh, different from that which you have been led to believe, whether it is by programming, by the outside world, by your family, or otherwise, right? So, with and because of this being the case, what fundamentally happens, and part of the greater problem is that our society at large is very much programmed in someone somewhat like a matrix, which is what is conducive for these groups' personalities to fester and grow. And so, when you think about ideological fragmentation or how to weaponize someone's entire identity and emotions, you must understand how to first fragment them, right? Which is what every cult or narcissist will do, right? And in a lot of ways, a cult is like a group think of this level of narcissism. But essentially, in the world I come from, I worked at a company where the narrative was that buying and selling a stock is the antithesis of building wealth and all of these things, right? So that within of itself, if you're in that world, is a fundamentally conflicting narrative from what that which we all know to be true, even statistically so. But what happens when you introduce a concept or a subject matter that is fundamentally against everything people believe to be true, you in that moment create a fragmentation, ideological fragmentation, a seismic shift, a shock, a identity crisis, whatever you want to call it. And with that, you are able to deflect, you're able to not answer any real questions, you're able to get away with really saying anything because rather than being having to answer any real radical questions or introspection, you are then able to deflect to the two parts of someone that you fundamentally partitioned. And in doing so, you become the judge, jury, and arbiter of someone's entire emotions and ideological narrative. And so once you're able to fragment that, you can galvanize those emotions and weaponize them from whatever you want. And the reason why this works is because until we have a serious conversation as a society about the deep rooted inner child trauma and coping mechanisms that this society benefits from and thrives from and capitalizes from, whether it's drugs, food, alcohol, sex, entertainment, media, or otherwise, we're never going to actually get to the bottom of what it is that creates this, right? And so when this happens, you're able to then this only happens because we live in a world that capitalizes from this, right? So the point by which people become radicalized is to equal and opposite reaction of the galvanizing of the deep rooted trauma that has not been addressed, integrated, felt, or healed. And so then what happens is that you uh, pair that with righteous indignation, right? You pair that with the idea that you've been cheated, you've been wrong, you've been whatever, and so then you are then you hijack someone's entire emotion, and you're able to cannibalize them and catapult it because you are tapping into the deep rooted unhealed trauma that they are facing, they're dealt with, that they're feeling, and then you are then therefore simultaneously then bringing it to present tense into something that is now outside of what they believe to be true, and now you can now pair that which you associate with the culprit of the liar, antagonistic figure or otherwise, and go all the way down to their inception point of all their pain, suffering, deflection, trauma, what have you, everything that drives them to be whoever they are. And then you can cannibalize and catapult it in any direction you want by then uh, by then using the identity politics or emotions that you're galvanizing and you're triggering, and then you can catapult them wherever, right? Because now that you've gone away from being able to make someone, now that you're the sole judge, jury, and arbiter of all of their emotions by introducing that ideological fragmentation and being able to successfully deflect from any real questioning, now you can cannibalize that fragmentation to gaslight them in an endless loop and then cannibalize their emotions however you want. And so first and foremost, I want to start off by saying that I do not believe in any way, shape, or form. And not only do I not believe, I will make the case that Trump and Trumpism is within and of himself not a cult or a cult of personality. And so I want to go line item by line item as depicted by, again, cult research of what composites a cult of personality. So, first and foremost, just because Trump himself is not a cult of personality does not mean that they are not cults of personality built around him, right? So something that right away we have to be able to discern is Trump the person, um and Trump the character has been able to be has been galvanized right across the board by all different mediums. And so um yes, and any movement, and so that's something that I am going to go through as well. Reading here the comment section is why the political movements at large are perpetrators of this kind of ideological fragmentation, and why it is really the political moves and forces that have drove us and that have drove society to this level of gaslighting and polarization. Because until we have very deep rooted conversations about inner child trauma and all of the culprits and perpetrators that composite that, we're never going to get into any real solutions, which then goes back into how we came to this world where people are so exacerbated by anything and everything in every way. And so, um, so I just want to read this comment, right? So I think just like how spiritually or anything in this plane can have its true pieces be perverted by the masses and led astray, any movement has the potential to become distorted, and that's very much true. And so that's why the purpose of this video, Grace, thank you so much for your comment. That's why the purpose of this video is very much to go over all of the ways in which we have been both the victims and the prey of this, so then we can actually break free from it and address actual solutions, right? So the first quality of a cult, and the reason why I will say that Trump himself is not one, is because he is never portrayed himself to be the only, not only the only savior, but he's never even portrayed himself to be the sorry, my kitten is running around, but portrayed to be the answer, right? His whole narrative with America First does not even begin with him. His narrative of America First started with Ronald Reagan, right? And if you think about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or the aspect of non-interventionalism, which brought America first in terms of Ronald Reagan. And people can talk over the Vedusian mechanics that and motives that can posit that. But if you just look at it from that angle, it's about putting life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the fact that all men are creating equal first, above the illusion of separation, the fragmentation, the cultural narratives, or otherwise, and failure to do so if you antagonize people under a racist narrative and not address, for example, the mechanics of how a dollar works here, or people exporting goods and services or money to other countries or within their own culture, you're inevitably going to lose the principles of this country that are rooted in that oneness as one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That comes ahead of the separation, which means not to uproot your culture and your roots, but rather to put that we have more in common than we do different. And no matter what God you believe in, we come from the same one first. And that ideology of all men being created equal in life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and limited government and free will, um, above the separation, right? So that just within of itself was never about Trump as a figure, right? So often the left will say that he is people worship him, and I've never met anybody who does. I've met people that deeply resonate with his message, that activated something within him, or within themselves, that they saw in him, right? Is that kind of like awakening activation that, and I've said it in so many examples, but the whole concept of America First is really getting rid of the culture of, have you ever gotten dressed really nicely for your husband, for your wife, or did a lot of work for your husband or wife or partner, significant other, child, mother, sister, what have you, and they don't acknowledge it. And then you go out to dinner, you go out to eat, and then they compliment the waiter's hard work and how good they look, or the waitress, while having not acknowledged you yet, right? It's really uprooting the culture that allows us to really exalt the quality in others while simultaneously subverting that within our own households, right? At large, right? America First is self healing first, and then um, inspiration through a peace through strength, right? An individual strength, and then collective strength, and then through inspiration. And so, for that reason, and off the bat, I will say he's not a cult of personality or a cult like figure, because he is not self depicting as the judge or an arbiter, but rather something larger. In his particular case, America First. And when you think about making America great, it has more to do, again, more so with, as I understand it, non interventionalism, putting Black, white, Asian, Muslim, gay, trans, whatever, Americans before others, and going back to um, a culture where people were able to feed themselves and live in a living wage. So, with that said, the first um, cult of personality here, the first point is the group displays an excessively zealous and unquestioning commitment to its leader, whether he is dead or alive, in regards to a belief system, ideology, practices as the sole truth and as the law. So, now people that galvanized around this. Now, from my, so this is actually where I do take issue with the GOP, is because as I've gotten more, as I've gotten more to know the local groups here in Texas specifically, um, and I love like when Red, everyone there's been amazing and what have you, but there's some people that I can tell are more performative, and so they don't have any core beliefs, which I think is very clear that Trump does. I do. Again, to me, law of one, or the Constitution is rooted in that universal law of oneness, right? That transcends time, space, motion, political party, or otherwise. I think it seems safe to say that true conservatism, or even Trump, has more to do with that law of oneness than this performative whatever, right? And we can see this even with the homophobia in the Texas Republican Party, right? Again, but just because people are, going back to your point, Grace, people, just because people are distorted or distorting an ideology or distorted within themselves, doesn't mean the principles of a political ideology are themselves distorted. In the same respect, we have greater responsibility of calling out those distortions from within ourselves, as you would discipline your child before you discipline your neighbor's child, first, right? Which, again, with Ted Cruz, and then his statement about whatever he said about Pansy, I was like, first of all, here are all the military leaders that have a lot more claws than you. Myself having more claws than you, and how if we're going to really focus on the issues on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we cannot give people ammunition and focus and ammo to then deflect from a seriously solid point to then homophobia and bigotry, because now you just gave people license to deflect from your entire point, existence, narrative, and everything you have to say to now just be summarized and summed into a single homophobic statement, which is a discredit to yourself, it's a discredit to the party, it's a discredit to the greater ideology, it's a discredit really, and that's really where the law of one really goes deep, right? Because it's a discredit to society at large, right? You are discrediting a solid point, something that we all believe in that defies time, space, motion, gender, or what have you, and now you've correlated to the summation of homophobia, right? Same with the Texas the Texas party and their unwillingness to admit like the Lackawanna Republicans. Again, you're not going to win by separating the masses. It's not godly. No, Jesus never said this. No, Son of Master said to separate the masses, to condemn anyone, and not to mention that sexuality within of itself has nothing to do with sex, but rather experiencing unconditional love and that awakening in material embrace, and whether that comes to the same or opposite sex. So there's a performative aspect within the Republican Party that is very problematic. I think the most existential problematic thing to the GOP at large, right? Because then you can make it all about uh, Trump and focus on a cult of personality, when really the problem is that a lot of these people have no core beliefs or anything beyond just performative wokeness and separation and what have you, right? And the sad part about that is that there is so much power in universal law, and with great power comes great responsibility. And the greatest lies ever told have a lot of truth in them. And I think that's the problem with the Republican Party, is I don't think people understand the responsibility that comes with being the party of that is made to be in the image of a higher power, right, of source, and then the distortions are that much more uh weighted heavier and more egregious for that reason, right? And so in that sense, yeah, it could be said that a lot of the rhinos are for lack of a better term, really, but what I mean by that is the performative aspects of it, right? It's like, we believe in this and that, but your actions don't actually reflect that, right? It's performative, right? And I think that's what that term conveys, is the performative aspect of those beings, right? So, questioning doubt and dissent and discourage are even punished. Again, now I'm going to start with, this is actually very prevalent on the left, right? This level of, if you do not align with our ideology, you're a racist. And so it goes back to the scientific theory, right? Or the scientific method, right? Questioning is an integral part of scientific method. To remove questioning is to fundamentally remove science from the equation, right? The left, the pandemic, none of this can be questioned on a serious manner without the narrative being hijacked and then being labeled as fake news, even as we are now finding out a lot of this to be true. um, so that is not only not science, but it is in that aspect, it is draconian, it's anti-democratic, it's not science, and that's where you really begin to see the cult of the left establishment in the institution, or really the cult of the establishment in the institution, being projected onto the masses and then triggering the fear within them of their own shadow being galvanized on the opposition, right? So the next point is mind altering practices um, and debilitating work routines. So again, this is very prevalent with the establishment in the institution, right? You work people into oblivion, and they have, just to survive, and then use and access to service or press doubts of the group or its leader. And so, this I believe can be seen on both sides of the aisle, where the more you get people to really work to where they cannot even really survive, um, you really then you're working them into oblivion. And it does go back to, what quality of life do we want for people? But going back to this is a general establishment that is very much about debilitating the resources of empowerment of the opposing side of, the masses, right, or the populace. And so the next point is, the leadership dictates, sometimes in great detail, how members should think, act, and feel. Members must get permission to date, change jobs, marry, um, uh, what they wear, where they live. or otherwise, right? And so again, this can be seen. I've never really seen anybody on the right say you cannot talk to someone because they're a Biden supporter or what have you, whereas you do see a lot on the left saying that you cannot question the narrative, you cannot engage with those who question the narrative, you cannot a family member should be denounced. I've heard a lot of people in the media say that you should even refuse to gather with family over this. Again, I don't find this to be present on the right. I could be wrong, but I just personally haven't seen or experienced it. Same with Trump rallies. I've never heard anybody be antagonistic to. Then again, to be fair, also across the board is that I've only been to the Trump rallies in Beverly Hills because since I've been in Texas, I haven't seen one. So that might be a different kind of transporter, but just my experience that has never been um, that level of polarization. I will say though, with the Trump and going back to him activating something that resonates within the masses, is that in order to awaken the masses to the degree in which there has been some programming, and I think we wouldn't have things like political polarization, QAnon, or leftist polarization if there wasn't a fundamental shaky foundation by which these uh, thorns can really uproot themselves in, and that's the whole thing about being programmed. But in that sense, if you look at this, you do have a political elite, right? You do have, CNN must not be questioned, Fauci must not be questioned, and you can be a defender of liberty, life, pursuit of happiness, LGBT equality, gay rights, black rights, against police brutality, and simultaneously not subvert every aspect of your ideological framework to fit the narrative of the establishment elite, right? And the fact that those two are conflated is again a depiction of the very cult-like programming that Americans have particularly endured from one side of the aisle or the other. And so um, you also see the exalted state of elitism when you think about phrases like the deplorables or all the horrible things that a lot of the elite says about the right and its members that is not present it's just not the right doesn't speak this in this degrading form to the left or if you have any beef with any one individual, it would be an individual. Tulsi Gabbard's very popular on the right, and there, it's not an aisle thing, but the right does polarize, or the left, excuse me, does polarize it to that degree. And so then the next point is the polarized us versus them mentality. This is not really present with QAnon. Is not present really with the Republicans, as I've seen with the left, right, where it's very much um, deplatform them, censor them. The only thing you show people by censoring them is that you're scared of what they have to say. And so that's very prevalent with that's very prevalent with the left. Excuse me, my kittens are running around. And so the leader's not accountable to any authorities. Again, so this is where you really begin to see how this is really not present in the Trump organization, because Trump is being persecuted excessively, right? Trump is being I mean, now they're even saying, oh, they're going to arrest them and all these things in New York. In fact, so much so that someone ran a whole campaign in New York about um, persecuting him, right? How do you run an honest, legitimate campaign on persecution of someone when you don't even know the facts or have been voted in, right? That is the antithesis of justice, right? It's the antithesis of all of these things. And so, in that sense, there in no way, shape, or form is Trump above the law. In fact, has been incessantly scrutinized by it. Whereas, to, for example, figures like Fauci that have, possibly the case of the world's largest case of involuntary manslaughter, with whether it was by accessory to conspiracy or tampering with evidence, tampering with witnesses, tampering with, um, best case scenario is that he is an accessory to involuntary manslaughter. If there was the Wuhan lab implications, if that's true, best case scenario is involuntary manslaughter, um, tampering with evidence, tampering with witnesses, as well as social media, tampering with evidence, tampering with witnesses. Um, Worst case scenario is accessory to bioweapon terrorism, right? Accessory to conspiracy, accessory to all of these things. And so if nobody's talking about these people going to prison, right? And we think about a quote unquote deep state, is unelected officials that transcend um, people that are voted into office. They transcend, uh, they're not voted in. They outlast these people, and they have no accountability. There has been really no questioning or accountability of Fauci in this, right? Whereas Trump has been questioned incessantly by the law and the news, so and the political rhetoric. So in that sense, he is not above the law, whereas it can be said the deep state or the establishment elite are above the law. Same with the fact that, for example, in many states, it is against the law to practice or to give explicit medical advice while not being a doctor or licensed to practice medicine. Whereas, for example, Bill Gates has been able to do this with no accountability, with no medical license, whereas I understand. Um, I could be wrong, but how is this? It's against the law. It's blatantly, overtly against the law. Same with the fact that, for example, he has had a nonprofit that investigates vaccines and pandemics around the world. That is not a secret. It is within his own website. I've cited it in my campaign details, right? So we know he's been investigating these pandemics for a long time. We know there was a meeting in 2019, the Agenda 21 meeting. That's well documented. That's not a conspiracy. We know that he has shares of vaccine companies, right? And so then he's engaging, therefore, in conflicts of interest, incentivizing people to go out and get vaccinated, not only as an unlicensed medical figure, but also in direct conflicts of interest to his ownership and shares in company. And this whole narrative about the nonprofit is there is loopholes to nonprofits, which I believe they're called donor advised funds. It's again, it's in my political website somewhere, but they don't have to disperse their donations to a nonprofit, and they can even be inherited, and there is no time um, sphere for when this can happen, right? So here, thank you for a comment. Someone, for example, there's a great example of gaslighting where people were saying, for example, that hydroxychloroquine does not work. Well, I don't know if it does or doesn't work, but that's not what the doctor said. She said hydroxychloroquine staggered with, I believe it was like vitamin C and like all these other things, right? In conjunction, according to her and her medical degree, worked, right? But no one, the fact that she was an African American medical professional with a sovereign medical degree was completely written off within religious persecution, one, right, which is unconstitutional, uh, without actually addressing what she was saying too, and fundamentally switching the narrative, because she never said that hydroxychloroquine as a standalone supplement works. She said these start with these other things, right, which we all know to be true, right? There's so many medicines that you cannot take grapefruit juice with because they become exalted, right? So we know that staggering and compounding different medications have different effects, right? But that was all written off. Again, conspiracy to defraud, involuntary manslaughter. I mean, these are all serious questions, right? Or murder, right? Murder, if not involuntary manslaughter, if he did know and he subverted his knowledge for self-preservation. And there's this idea that just because, maybe I don't believe, for example, that Fauci did this for bioweapon terrorism, doesn't mean he wasn't an accessory to bioweapon terrorism, right? So the implications and the hiding and the tampering with evidence, tampering witnesses, working in collusion with government and private sector companies. Again, why this has more to do with socialism than the free market, right? The fact that government is colluding with social media platforms to censor the masses what we're learning is an actual narrative, that is a lot like communist China having their foot on every and all of these different private, quote unquote, or rather, yeah, producing companies, because I guess they're not entirely private in China. But how is that different in America, right? And is it different just because of minutia and legal paperwork and loopholes of working with government officials and then going through a consulting company and then advising from that point, and that's a loophole to registering as a foreign agent or what have you, right? So then we're having conversations about loopholes, again going back to gaslighting or to a fundamental ideological belief, which is what a lot of the Trump movement and the red pill ideology really represents. And so the next aspect of what composites a cult, so in that sense, that it's very strong on the left, where they are the judge, juries, and arbiters of galvanizing your emotions, and thus therefore weaponizing the entire narrative and the people that composite the trauma bonds they've themselves galvanized. And so The elitists again can be seen with the deplorables in that narrative. The group has polarized us versus them mentality. We already went over that. The leaders have no accountability. Again, Trump has a ton of accountability, like an enormous amount of accountability, whereas to the deep state, quote unquote, or these figures at the very least do not. The group teaches or implies that it supposedly exalted ends justifying the means by whatever means necessary. I think it goes without saying how prevalent this is on the left, right? It is so prevalent that their ends justify the means. The whole, Josh Hawley was wrongfully crucified for his constitutional right to question aspects of the election during the vote count. What he was doing was within his constitutional right. It was also within the will of his constituents and his voters, and all of that was deflected and subverted, and the constitutionality of it, because of the what happened in January 6th, right? So the January 6th commission should not be approved without serious questioning of why the officers were told to stand down if they were led by Nancy Pelosi, right? That's a serious question. So to omit an entire fragmentation or an entire integral part of that narrative from an investigation should be omitted and denounced. Not to mention that it was asymmetrically targeting those that composite the body of the predominant GOP or the conservatives, whereas everything that happened last year is not being equally addressed. Again, going back to the previous points about the cult, right? So, in that sense, you're asking a political party to judge their own constituents harder than that of the left because they were willing to approve the commission should they have waited to the same and equal and opposite reaction that which happened last year, and the implications of the voice of the unheard as stated by Nancy Pelosi, the implications of that which Maxine Waters said, which is, as a statement of fact, a lot more incendiary than anything that Trump said. And again, and it's why we're beginning to see the way that the left internalizes and is deeply scared of this cult of personality because they understand the shadow that they've attributed in the way they've personally weaponized it. So when people say you would never do something like this, or say that humanity would be incapable of doing this, no, you're saying you yourself aren't capable of doing it. If humanity was capable of doing it, it wouldn't be happening, right? So it's projecting that aspects within themselves and the party onto the opposing side of the aisle. Same with the antagonizing for the removing Liz Cheney from leadership. That is a Democratic constituent thing to do. When she does not represent the will of her constituents, why should she have a leadership position? And the fact that the left then turns around and says that they are undemocratic for this, it is the epitome of democracy. They are listening to the will of the constituents that composite their body and acting in accordance to the will of those constituents, saying this woman does not believe the will of the constituents and should therefore be removed from leadership, but she wasn't stripped from her congressional role, right? So there's this entire false narrative that she was stripped of her constitution. No, she wasn't. She still has her constitutional powers or her congressional powers or her elected powers. So that's the embodiment of democracy, whereas the left will subvert the will of their people, the questioning of the integrity of what happened in the on January and all of that uh, for what they perceive to be the greater good, right? And so that again being very present in that, and so this goes into lying, family, friends, collecting money for bogus charities, etc. Right? Again, this can be seen with the Russia narrative. This can be seen with the um, across the board. It can be seen on every facet of the establishment left. The leadership induces feelings of shame or guilt in order to influence or control its members, often done so through peer pressure and subtle forms of persuasion. So this is again very prevalent because they are very incendiary um, to anything that questions their narrative, right? And they're very quick to call someone deplorable, racist, or write off someone's entire human existence and sovereignty to nothing more than just a racist or to nothing more. I mean, look at what happened with Roseanne, right? Roseanne didn't even know, and I don't know the full story, but as I understand it, she didn't even know the background of this woman, right? She just kind of said whatever she thought about saying in the middle of the night. So I mean, insensitive? Yes. But is it racist? Well, if she didn't know the race of the person, then I don't imagine how she weaponized it. But again, this level of even the idea that you must vote for Biden because, again, with extreme polarity, even if you disagree with everything he's done, because it justifies the greater good, it's another symptom of that very exalted cult like behavior that we do see expressed on the left, in my opinion, and going down the bullet points of how it's expressed on the left, in contrast to personal empowerment or whatever you believe, which is a very prevalent of the on the right, which is whatever you believe, act on that so long as it's constitutional. By de facto, it's anti-cult in that sense that it doesn't say follow me, follow him, follow that. It's like, do you believe in these universal laws or not? Subservience to the leader or group requires members to cut ties with family and radically alter the person's goals and activities before joining the group. And this is super prevalent again with the narrative that don't talk to your family if they're Trump supporters or what have you, but also in the way that, if you think about the issues that a lot of the progressive left cares about, college and tuition, right? Joe Biden was a primary perpetrator of what has landed us in this college situation. If you think about police reform and brutality, Biden was a perpetrator of this frisk and the passage of this. If you think about really universal racist rhetoric, Biden has an enormous history of racist rhetoric, whereas Trump really doesn't. There was one case that was against his father about rental units that was settled for time's sake, but never admitted guilt or something like that. But Biden has black and white uh, depictions of this. In fact, so much so, and this actually goes back to the entire point too. That's so much so that Joe Biden was willing to crucify all of Georgia, right, which is one of the predominant states with black-owned businesses and prosperity and what have you. And he was willing to sacrifice by saying that the MLB and all of these companies should boycott the entire state, which is the first time that we see a president galvanize and boycott against the union for his own self preservation, for his own narrative, meaning that very literally he offered the people of Georgia as tribute for his end goal. And those are the very people that got him to where he is in the election. And he did so without question. And the fact that he didn't think twice about the implications and the people that it would affect, so long as it justifies his personal narrative, is the embodiment. It is the embodiment of racism, cultural abuse, cult abuse, offering someone as tribute for their own narrative, because someone that truly cares about a group of people would never accidentally offer them as tribute for their own self gratifying agenda, right? Someone that is genuinely scared of snakes would not accidentally find themselves in a snake den, right? If Gavin Newsom really believed what he was saying about COVID-19 and how frightening it is, right, and the perpetuation of how dangerous it quote unquote is, he wouldn't accidentally find himself without a mask in a public place, right? When you're scared of spiders, you don't accidentally just casually find yourself in a den of tarantulas and forget that you're scared of spiders. That doesn't happen, right? So it's that um, incessant guilt and shame perpetuated by the establishment elite, in conjunction with media and what have you, to degrade you into oblivion should you question the narrative, right? Subservience to the leadership or group requires members to cut ties with family and friends and before joining the group for its own agenda. Again, this goes back to the progressive left being forced to and gaslit, shamed, and antagonized into voting for someone who fundamentally not only defies what they believe, but was the perpetrator of these belief systems, right? So, for anybody that understands the implications of the occult, right, there's a figure named Baphomet who says to create chaos and then to fix it. And if you think about the actions of a lot of these political groups, right, or the left, right, you create chaos and then you fix it. This can kind of be seen on Maleficent, which kind of looks like Baphomet too, the Angelina Jolie rendition where she coerces the girl, but then she saves her at the end of the movie. And when you're able to do that, again, you become the judge, jury, and arbiter of someone's entire ideological narrative, and you're able to galvanize all of their emotions and catapult them whichever way you want, because you're leveraging their trauma bonds, and you are the inception of that fragmentation of ideology, identity, politics, or otherwise. And so then, by fragmenting them, you're never truly questioned. You can turn them on one another and galvanize them whichever way you want. This is very prevalent again on the culty establishment left that composites this. And so and so that's why I often say I respect AOC and a lot of them, even Nancy a lot, because they at least are willing to have, well, AOC at least is willing to have honest conversations. And if you never get to having an honest conversation, you never come up with a solution because you are having a performative, superficial conversation, and thus you will never come to a solution because no real conversation can be had. And so again, this is what we see so much with the establishment elite. The group is preoccupied with bringing new members. Again, we see this incessantly with the Democratic Party, right? This incessant preoccupation with bringing new members, whereas to the right is more on the ideology of conveying your message to people and voting with their values, right? Even if you disagree with their values, it's not about galvanizing and bringing people in by any and all means. And the incessant preoccupation with raising money, right? This can be seen across the political spectrum and how so much of it is centered around raising money. However, dollars and shares cannot vote. So then why is your preoccupation to the degree of raising money? And so members are expected to devote inordinate amounts of time to the group and group related activities. This is generally true with anybody whose emotions can be galvanized just in general, and or volunteer on canvas or what have you. Members are encouraged and required to live and or socialize with other members of the group. Again, this is entirely done in the left, and the way it antagonizes people that don't agree with them under the illusion of discrimination and racism. That I'm sure is true by some people, but it's not the overarching theme that unites life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or one nation under God, indivisible, right? And so the most loyal members fear that they can be no outside life outside of the context, right? So there's no other way to be. And this is really the problem with identity politics, that you're galvanizing people to identify solely by their trauma bonds, coping mechanisms, by their all their archetypal wounds, gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, national identity. And in doing so, you then inversely cannibalize and weaponize the trauma that they've experienced in that fragmentation, which anything that's fragmented would have by de facto experienced trauma. And then you're able to cannonball them and catapult them whichever way you want, and incessantly in whatever way you want. So those are all the basic characteristics of what composes a cult. And I want to have an open conversation because it's important to focus on the solutions, but we're never going to get into any real answers so long as people will continue to be galvanized and weaponized by the media and by the establishment elite and by uh, the cult characteristics that are so pervasive. And it's why the left is able to galvanize um histrionics, hysteria, borderline personality disorder, and the distorted feminine characteristics within male or female. That's neither here nor there, but it's able to cannibalize those distortions because it's weaponizing that degree of trauma, and it's weaponizing that identity to then go into directions, right? One, the exalting the identity, um, and then in exalting the identity, you're exalting the trauma, and then you're able to cannibalize and catapult them whichever way you want. So they are essentially using people's trauma as fuel for their own self-preservation, for their own underlying narrative, without addressing any real underlying questions. Right? We're not addressing why are people addicted to blood, right? When you eat a lot of meat, there's an addiction to it from the hemoglobin that triggers an opiate like response, right? You can I cited it in my comment community section of YouTube, where I go over all. If you really want to address the actions of Q, you need to answer in good faith all these questions, right? Addiction to meat, but more importantly about the addiction to meat is, if it's so bad for the environment, if it's all of these things, why is it being subsidized? Why is nobody talking about its addiction? Why is not so? Studies have been linked to meat consumption and heart disease, diabetes, and or otherwise, um, and the blood in meat triggers. Let me see. So a thick, juicy steak can be addictive because the blood in red meat contains albumin, hemoglobin, and gamma globin chemicals that activate the body's opiate receptors, just like heroin, but on a smaller scale. And this is coming from Google, cited on June 2nd, from the Food Network, right? So those things have to be addressed. Why there's a subversion to so many questions about why lying about the narrative, why I'm just going to read out as I close this video what I wrote about the valid questions. If people want to address Q, then they need to honestly address these questions. And so, um, even actually something about even the whole COVID narrative and possibly coming from a lab, that also brings up a lot of questions about AIDS, right? Because the common denominator here between COVID and between AIDS, is Dr. Fauci, and does he have any implications with the exacerbation of the virus, right? Was this, there's something very similar in felines, right? That's very similar to AIDS, or the feline immune deficiency syndrome. So, was there a gain of function leak with AIDS, right? There's so many questions, and it really begs to question a lot of these things. So something that people want to define or to say, like, we need to address Q, we need to have a conversation about, someone from the TYT was saying, these people believe in Satan. Well, you have to define Satan, and to define Satan, you have to define a thought, imagination, creativity. Where does it come from, and can it be influenced by unquantifiable mediums? And to what degree some may perceive Satan to be someone's individual shadow, or the collective shadow, or the resonance that such darker polarity embodies, and the figure with the wings and the horns is just the human depiction, interpretation of that. Another aspect that people want to address, if they want to address the quote unquote conspiracy behind Q, is, we know that time and space is man-made. That we know from science, right? So then, is there any implications for example, Neuralink? And people, we know that humans have more pain receptors, trauma receptors. The negative things that happen to someone last longer than the positive ones in terms of ruminations and state. So if people all upload their consciousness into something like a Neuralink, and we go to this technocratic world, well, all of these people's traumas are going to be shared and uploaded into a cloud, and the cloud is going to be stored with servers, right? Are the servers going to be underground with these bunkers and what have you? So then, is that the man-made interpretation of hell as depicted by the Bible, in that sense, right? So that has to be addressed. How do you define all of these words and characteristics and what have you? If you're going to talk about antagonizing Q over demons, we have to understand, well, how do we define demons? How do we define the things that the ocular system cannot see? How do we define, the eyes, human eyes can see gamma rays, X-rays, radio waves? How do we define consciousness? How do we define the influence of the darker resonance, right? So when people drink alcohol, we call them spirits, right? Tequila gives you a different drinking resonance than vodka, that's different from so on and so forth, right? That chemical toxicity, right? Is there a quantification for that, right? Speaking about like I said, the blood addiction that humans have, and is there a matrix synergy that keeps people in a perpetual state? And do we address, if this is to be true, does access to more resources give people a greater high, and varying on different meats, right? The whole thing with Army Hammer, right? Like when that came out, how do we address this as a society and not bypass it? If we're going to say that all of this is a false narrative, well, we need to address them when they come out in mainstream media, right? Or on a mainstream narrative. Um, so if we're going to address the issue of trafficking, which is a very real issue, why is this being subverted by mainstream media? Why is no one talking about the trafficking that's happening on the southern border, right? So if these things are not conspiracies, why are they being subverted? Why are they not being talked about? Why is the fact that many people have reported that about 1 in 3 girls in women and boys and girls that are being trafficked into the United States are being raped, molested, or what have you. Why is no one talking about that, right? If there's no conspiracy, why are we not talking about this, right? If there's no conspiracy on the degree of trauma these people endure, if there's no conspiracy, why are we not talking about the fact that MGT is right in saying that the cartels are very much having the time of their life right now because they're making so much money from the Biden administration rhetoric and trafficking people here, right? They're making a ton of money. And by the way, before someone crosses the American border, they cross the Mexican border. And those people are causing havoc in Mexico, right? So it's why the Mexican president actually really likes Donald Trump because before they cross this border, they cross the Mexican southern border and they're wreaking havoc on their people. The people trafficking them are a lot of times are Mexican, but they're the the level of criminality coming into Mexico from their southern border. Yeah, Mexicans are very angry about. The president is angry about, right? So to say that it's racist, first of all, I don't know that Mexican is a race, but no, it's absolutely true that we're wreaking havoc on our girls, on our if you have family in Mexico, it's wild over there, right? This is being perpetuated by the trafficking that is coming from the southern border of Mexico, right? So again, the fact that the media just glides over this and bypasses this, obviously people are going to feel, there's no conspiracy. Why are we not having these conversations, right? The implications about Army Hammer and the cannibal situation and the quite documented allegations that this is an elitist family that has generations of this level um, of actions, right? Now, these are allegations. I'm not saying these to be true, but these conversations are not being had by mainstream media. Why are they being suppressed, right? So, if we know, if it's true that the most existential threat that this country faces is this idea of domestic terrorism and Q, then we need to address all of these concerns because there's a lot of concerns that are not being addressed by mainstream media that are far more concerning to the majority of Americans um, than this boogeyman, right? So with that said, I hope this video was helpful. I do want to have an open conversation because I am very passionate about overcoming cults, right? And cult like behavior and being survivors of something like this, right? In my previous workplace, something that was very systemically entrenched in our training was identity versus role and the defragmentation of identity, which yeah, it led to a spiritual awakening, I guess, by self-degradation, by losing yourself entirely into oblivion. Simultaneously, someone that worked at the company later, I recently found out, was a huge mobilizer of the QAnon and really weaponized aspects of it for what seems to be violent rhetoric. And the fact that he came from where I used to work made it very clear to me that this systemic culture that breeds the worshiping of money, and this particular company that really I was never persecuted by the federal regulators. I submitted a lot of my concerns to the FBI recently, though, and the way and explaining to them comprehensively the way they're able to fragment someone's ideology to cannibalize and create these kinds of figures that then later brought us Q is very relevant and allegedly, and I don't know how true this is, but supposedly the founder of the company was like intelligence for the Israeli military, which I don't know that I really believe. Apparently, he stole a bunch. He was in prison for like illegal diamond sales or something like that. But my point is that if we don't address the systems and culture and companies and MLMs and all this that breed this level of cult behavior, including our own country, right? If you think about putting patriotism, it's putting something, an ideology that sometimes is fed to you by a specific agency or narrative or political party above your own free will, the greater good for yourself and personal empowerment. But these companies, these MLMs, these things that really breed identity degradation entirely, to uh, the what happens when you completely destroy someone's identity, which I posted on my LinkedIn, is they do go on and create these kinds of things. If they're screwed to the degree in which I guess they detailed that they were, but also the way that these companies have very real implications, how gaslighting into oblivion, which I don't believe Trump to be doing, um, because everything that's not edited by the media, it's very much about personal empowerment, which a cult is always going to be fundamentally against. It's always going to be, this is the solution, we are the solution, I am the solution, something like that. It's never going to be empowering you. um, and so to address what so much of mainstream is now concerned about, you have to address the implication and the role that they've played in creating this system, and the lack of accountability that has happened against actors of these systems, whether it be deep state or the Faucis of the world, or these private companies or these MLMs that don't never get persecuted and just get a slap on the wrist. Because um, yes, so guacamole, that does go. There are a few families that consider themselves bloodline families, that they're descendants of the fallen, right? And that goes into like the Rh negative blood type and Shroud of Turin. And my other channel, RLD Return of the Consciousness, goes over a lot of that. This is my trading channel, and I guess now my political one too. But um, yes, that kind of goes. So part of, you bring up a good closing point. Part of my point about Q and all of this is that when you begin to ask the right questions, we're all going to come down to the truth. That is, like, this idea that Nancy Pelosi or like AOC or like these people are like the perpetrators of what's happening. They're not. Like, they're not. They're just not. They don't make enough. They are just as gaslit as anybody else, right? They're on the opposing side of the spectrum, but they're not the judges and arbiters of what is happening. And so it isn't the best. It isn't the benefit of even the establishment that truly doesn't understand why this is happening and does have good intention and good faith. It is to their benefit, because the only people that are scared of being questioned are people that are lying to you. The only people that, when it comes to the deep state, right, or any person that has not been elected by the masses, that transcends the time and office of any political candidate, congressional candidate, or otherwise, is um, the it is going to be ultimately, as we begin to ask the right questions, we're all going to find the truth. And by finding that truth, we're all going to come to that universal oneness absolution. And so, um, yeah, I do have a lot to say in that sense. But um, yeah, I even go over a lot of the rituals, right? Like in the other channel of just even how through the day we make all kinds of agreements with ourselves, right? Like, oh, if I do this, I cannot do that, right? If even when you pray, right? So the thing is that people, especially the elite, I feel cannot necessarily quantify the implications of what they're doing or what they're saying. But that's neither here nor there. That's for my other channel. This one I just really want to focus mostly on the facts. Um, but in that sense, the people that are anybody in good faith should always try to get to the bottom of the truth beyond political polarization, because there is peace, absolution, and solace for everyone. And someone that is lying to you does not have your best interest. Someone that is omitting information from you does not have your best interest, or doesn't, or simply doesn't respect your free will. They don't respect that if you have all the information, you will subvert to their own willingness to do, right? So even the people that are well intended, which I think AOC is, I think there's a lot of people on the left that are, um, it is, and to her credit, I would say she does question the narrative quite substantially. Um, it is to your benefit to question authority, because if they do have your best interest at heart, they're going to answer your question honestly. If you don't, they are at the very least subverting your free will, subverting the idea that you can make decisions on your own or that you can rationalize. But the reality is they're lying to you, because they don't want you to know what they're doing, because they themselves are not proud of what they're doing, because they do have something to hide and they are lying to you, right? If the ends justify the means and they truly believe that, and if we were not a slave society, we simply wouldn't have classification of anything, right? Why should anything be classified? Why do we trust it's why I love Edward Snowden so much. He honored his role and duty to the Constitution, not to an agency, not to a false god, not to a self-appointed judge, jury, and arbiter of a narrative of worship of all of these things of who is Obama? Who is anybody to say that spying on you is for your benefit? Who made them the judge, jury, and arbiter of that decision? Not votes, right? Not democracy, right? So this idea, this gaslighting narrative that this is to preserve the country. First of all, if Americans agree that this is the greater good for America, why hide it from them? Why not explain to America, look, this is what's happening? The reality is, and like Edward Snowden pointed, none of this has ever led to anything other than empowering those that are unelected official, whether it's social media, being able to sell information back to other people. It's not, and the same with the Republican Party, right? This ideology that, like, oh, it's democracy or it's capitalism. If you believe in capitalism, you do not believe in gridlocking. You do not believe in crony capitalism. You do not believe in any of that. You believe in a free market. And whenever you start to subsidize certain companies, whenever you start to tip the scale and work with social media or what have you, that is not capitalism. That is aligned with socialism. That is aligned with communism, where you have countries like China who do work in collusion with private sector entities. And in that sense, what happened with the election, as depicted by Time Magazine, is a lot more in alignment with China working with private governments and or excuse me, private companies in the private sector for a common end goal that is divergent of trusting the people to be able to discern the information as it exists. It doesn't trust the people to be able to discern whether or not they should vote for Joe Biden based on the actions we are seeing, Hunter Biden, engage in based on who is the big guy, who are all these things. They are making those decisions for you. That is not democracy. And if anybody on the left or any heavily programmed individual is going on this narrative that it's for the greater good of all, you are a victim of occult abuse, right? As defined by this cult.org. You are suggesting or implying that other people should decide for you what information you deserve to have. Someone else is the judge, jury, and arbiter of discourse. Someone else is the judge, jury, and arbiter of reasoning what you should and should not know. And the fact that there's so many people that are defending, oh, it's just a private company. It has implications, and they're a monolith and they're operating like a monopoly. There is no, like, there is this idea that when you talk about capitalism, there's an alternative, right? Well, if no one's willing to host your company, like, and the thing with Parler is a great example. No groups that showed up on January 6th even came from Parler. Even if you go with that narrative of the insurrection, which it wasn't, and it goes into the Declaration of Independence and duty and all of that. But even by that narrative, those people came from Facebook. So why was Parler deplatformed, but not Facebook, if that was the narrative, right? It's a lie. And the fact that people are so willful and subverting their own greater good for a narrative that they've been programmed with, it it's truly it's heartbreaking. It's fascinating in its own right. It's a lot of things, but it's not democracy. Not democracy as it's sold to us, right? Why should these companies, they decisively decided, outside of the question behind the election, right? Even if the mainstream narrative is true, they decided the election based on their collusion with government to suppress the truth, not fake news, not a statement of conspiracy, the truth. And they colluded with government to do so. If you don't correlate that to communism and you praise capitalism for this, I mean, I just I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. Um, in free speech, what resonates the deepest transcends, right? And I think we're finding out that maybe these things labeled as conspiracy by the Central Intelligence may have a lot more to do with the truth than the constant, now well documented lying that we have seen by the mainstream media, whether it was the big Wuhan lie or the well documented willful suppression of knowledge. And in manipulating knowledge, you're manipulating free will, you are manipulating discernment, you're playing the role of the judge, jury, and arbiter, you're playing the role of God, you are. Which is now why I feel that why I feel now we're here now to dispel this and really free people from bondage beyond political polarization and performative wokeness. And that's what I feel the new role of um, the Galactic Federation has disclosed by, I guess, some government officials, but the UFO disclosure and the Earth Alliance is now going to fundamentally uproot. So, with that said, the answer is always within you, and never subvert your own free will, your own intuition, your own discernment, thought, or concerns for what some human being is telling you the greater good is, because groupthink is the antithesis of free will. And the way you lead to a communist regime where you subvert the people into bondage is by removing free will, removing God, and then by doing, or a higher power, and by being able to do so, and removing the guns, which is what makes us different from other countries. And by doing so, you make false gods out of humans and are unable to defend yourself, and thus then they subvert humanity at large. So here we'll see the protocols of the illuminated sense of gold. Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah. Do you, Guacamole? Do you follow me on my other channel? Because I go over a lot of that there. But Yeah, like, comment, subscribe. Personal message me on Instagram, which is Ruben El Dante, if you want, or my email is rldprivateclients@gmail.com or rld for Congress. I'm super transparent about everything. But yeah, yeah, this is really important. So, with that said, I love you guys. Thank you for being here. Um, yeah, don't let groupthink tell you who you are. You tell them. And if your ideology resonates with aspects of it, support the aspects that resonates with. Do not blindly support a group or party that you don't know the ins and outs of, period. And never believe that. In fact, always question someone who seems to be under the belief that the suppression of the truth to you is for your greater good, because they're subverting you as a person at large. So, with that said, I love you guys. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you guys on the next video.